Hey, welcome back. Today we're looking at Dante's Paradiso, and we are up to the planet Saturn, and the final of the cardinal virtues. So as we rise to the last of the planets that Dante is going to visit before he goes on beyond the stars, he looks again to Beatrice's face, as he does at the beginning of pretty much every planet. But as he does, he notices that she's not smiling this time. She has increased in beauty, as she does every time, but she's no longer smiling. And she tells him, "I can't smile, because if I did, my smile would be so radiantly beautiful that it would just melt you, basically. If I smiled," she said, "you would become what Semele became when she was turned to ashes. For my beauty, which you have seen flame up more brilliantly the higher we ascend the stairs of this eternal palace, is so resplendent that, were it not tempered in its blazing, your mortal powers would be like tree limbs rent and scorched by lightning. My smile would burn your face off." And this is the first hint of what Saturn's all about. At first, we looked at faith, hope, and love, although in an imperfect kind of way. And then we looked at our other virtues. We looked at wisdom, we looked at courage, we looked at justice, and now here on Saturn, we're going to look at temperance. And we can see the idea of temperance has already been introduced in the way that Beatrice is holding back the beauty of her smile. At this point, Beatrice instructs Dante to go ahead and look and see what he can see here at Saturn. She uses double mirror imagery. And Dante is sort of torn between his desire to continue to look at her, but also his desire to follow her command. And his desire to follow her command is the only thing that could take his eyes away from her. And we have again this sense of balance and this sense of choice, which reminds me of a similar passage earlier in Paradiso. In Canto 4, when Dante is caught between two questions. But here again, he's directed and guided, and so he's given a clearer choice. This also hints at the idea of temperance in that he is ceasing his drinking in of her beauty, and instead is guided by her direction to make the better choice. At this point, Dante sees a beautiful golden ladder ascending from Saturn up into the heavens, and we immediately recall the image of Jacob's ladder, in which he saw angels ascending and descending from the throne of God. And Dante's going to have a similar experience here, because this is the point at which we leave behind all of the spheres, and we move on beyond that. And Dante sees some of the souls descending down the ladder to greet him. And as he watches them, we have another image of a flock that's moving within a pattern. And yet one soul does descend a little bit closer to Dante, and Dante says about this soul, "And the one that stayed the closest there to us grew so shining bright, I said, but not aloud, 'This sign makes clear your love for me.' But she, upon whose word I wait to know when and how to speak or to be silent, she keeps still, and I do well against my will to ask no question." Again, the idea of temperance. He's waiting for his guide to direct him to speak before he speaks, even though the desire is there. In temperance, there is the desire for something, but then choosing not to overindulge yourself in that thing. And she gives him permission first, saying, "Satisfy the ardent wish that burns within you." We see also that there are some wishes, especially as we ascend closer and closer to God, that there is no shame in partaking of and embracing fully. We're going to see that idea again in just a moment. But it's interesting here because these souls who are descending are not singing. This is the first place, and really the only place in heaven, where we don't hear song. And again, we have that image of temperance, choosing to hold back. And Dante wonders about this, so he asks these two questions to the soul who is approaching him. First of all, why are they descending down here and approaching him? And number two, why are they not singing? Why is there silence here? There's that sense of monastic silence. And the soul who answers him says, "Your hearing is as mortal as your sight. Thus, here there is no song for the very reason Beatrice has not smiled. I have come down the sacred ladder's rungs this far, only to bid you welcome with my words, and with the light that wraps me in its glow. It is not greater love that made me come more swiftly, for as much and more love burns above, as that flaming luminescence shows, but the profound affection prompting us to serve the wisdom governing the world has brought about the outcome you perceive." So the soul sort of distances himself from the personal aspect here. Dante assumes that this soul, whose name is Peter Damian, we find out in just a moment, has descended because of special love and affection for Dante. But Peter Damian points out that it's more his love for God and God's wisdom who has sent him on this task. And as we get closer and closer to God, we realize that all the good things that we choose to do are really directed by God's wisdom. And the more attuned we are with God, and the more in love we are with God, the less likely we are to make poor choices. And the better and more meaningful our choices are. So even our love for one another is really stemming from a greater love for God. And it's this choice between loves, choosing the greatest love of all, that ultimately makes everything richer and more beautiful. And that's the idea of temperance. These souls here are the contemplatives. And Dante is going to make a link between temperance and contemplation. These souls are monks who have dedicated their time and energy to prayer and reflection and meditation on God. And Dante sees that as a kind of temperance. By separating yourself from the rest of the desires of the world, you've grown closer to God. And growing closer to God grows you closer to His will, and therefore moves you to better action. And as we'll see, these souls didn't all stay necessarily locked up in a monastery away from the world. In fact, there's a lot of outward action within this section. But it's that outward action that comes from that deep love of God through contemplation and reflection, which ultimately guides them towards wise action. So Dante says, okay, I get that, but I'm interested in why God's wisdom moves you specifically as opposed to these other souls. Why were you foreordained, in fact, to be given this role? And at this point, Peter Damian begins to spin. His light spins around with love and joy, whirling like a quickly turning millstone, Dante says. And he answers like this: divine light focuses on me, piercing the radiance that holds me in its womb. Its power, conjoined with my own sight, raises me so far above myself that I can see the highest essence, the source from which it flows. And this inflames the joy with which I burn, for in the clarity of my sight I match the clearness of my flame. Nonetheless, the most enlightened soul in heaven, that seraph who fixes his eye on God, could not produce an answer to your question, for what you ask is hidden in the depths of the abyss of God's eternal law, so that the sight of any being He created is cut off from it. And as you go down towards earth again, Peter Damian continues, he says, the more smoky and cloudy things get in the mortal world. God's love draws me to Him. The closer I get to Him, the clearer my eyes see. The more clearer my eyes see, the more brightness I see. The more brightness I see, the more bright I am, the more I'm drawn closer. Again, that cycle that we've seen before. And it's that looking towards God, that contemplation, that is pulling this cycle into a tighter and tighter spin, I guess. But that still doesn't mean that you're going to get an answer to your question, because as we've seen before, like for instance with the justice down on Jupiter, there are aspects of God that are unfathomable to our limited minds. And one of them is why God chooses one person versus another for a certain task. Trying to force an answer out of God isn't going to get you anywhere, and you're wasting your time agonizing over that, Dante. So Dante backs down from his question and says, oops, let me ask a better question. Please tell me who you are. And so Peter Damian tells his story, and he was a contemplative. He was a monk who went and built a monastery. There I became so constant serving God, my simple fare seasoned with olive oil alone, that I readily endured the heat and frost, content in contemplation. That cloister which used to yield abundant harvest to the heavens now is barren, but soon its barrenness must be revealed. In that place I was known as Peter Damian, but Peter the sinner in the house of Our Lady on the Adriatic shore. Little of mortal life on earth was left to me when I was singled out and dragged to that red hat, which now is passed from bad to worse. Cephas came, and the exalted vessel of the Holy Spirit came lean and barefoot, receiving their food at any doorway. Now our modern shepherds call for one on this side, one to that, to support them. They are so bloated. And one to go before, one to boost them from behind. Their fur-lined mantles hang upon their horses' flanks so that the two beasts go underneath one skin. Oh, patience, what a heavy load you bear. So he describes his time of contemplation, how very far removed he was from the world, but then a pope came to him and asked him to become a cardinal. And this was not like the popes of Dante's day, as he points out, but rather a pope who walked barefoot, a pope who was also a contemplative. But he called Peter Damian because Peter could do a good work with what he had gained from his life of contemplation. And so we see sort of a mirror here with Picardia, who is down there on the moon. Do you remember how she was drawn out of her nunnery? And it was against her will, and we saw that was imperfect faith on her part. However, here, Peter Damian was reluctantly drawn away from his monastic duty, but he's drawn away for a higher cause because his contemplation readied him to serve the Lord in other ways. And the contemplation of the Pope who called him showed that both of them were attuned to God's will in their decision there. Unlike the fat, self-serving popes of Dante's day, who he describes here, being carried and coddled and fed. At the end of this, with his last little tirade against the popes, Dante sees the rest of the souls begin spinning and descending down. And as they spin around him, they cry so loud, Dante says, that nothing here could be compared to it, nor could I make it out. So did its thunder overwhelm me. Here's this cry, intense cry against the corruption of these awful popes. And it's so overwhelming, it's so thunderous, Dante can't take it. And we'll see at the beginning of the very next canto, in Canto 22, that Dante's going to run to Beatrice as a child runs to his mother. And here is, again, maybe a reversal of that temperance idea. Here is something that is so righteous, this indignation, this righteous anger, that it's okay not to temper it, even though it completely blows Dante's mind and terrifies him. Overcome by wonder, I turn to my guide, as does a child who always scurries back to the one who has his utmost trust. And she, like a mother, quick in comforting her son when he is pale and out of breath, with a voice that often calmed him in the past, said, "Don't you understand you are in heaven?" Their anger is directed against the popes in a righteous kind of way. And it's these popes who lack temperance, who lack contemplation of God, but instead only focus on their own desires and feeding and glutting their own greed and their own appetites. It's interesting that Dante puts temperance at the top here. We've been ascending, and here is our last big cardinal virtue, and he's going to put temperance there because it's the thing that helps keep you away from the distractions that keep you from God. And that focus helps him as he's stepping towards the top to really truly set his eyes on God. And Beatrice also points out, see how we were protecting you by not smiling, by not singing. Those things would have blown your mind as well. And see, this thunderclap of shouting was enough to frighten you like this. And she also says that this righteous call of justice is something that's going to ultimately benefit you because there is going to be more justice done in your life, Dante. You're going to see the fruit of some of the things that are going to happen. But she also says, turn around, there's other souls you need to meet. And as Dante looks at these other bright souls, again, he feels this sense of restraint, this sense of temperance. He says, I was as one who in himself restrains the spur of his desire, and fearing to presume dares not pose his question. The largest and most lustrous of those pearls advanced to satisfy my longing, to find out more about him. And Saint Benedict, who's the next soul he's going to talk to, says, could you see as I do the charity burning in our midst, you would have shared your thoughts with us, and that your arrival at the lofty goal be not delayed by waiting. I shall answer your guarded thoughts, which you dare not express. So there's love burning within us that's ready to answer you, Dante. Again, temperance is very, very important, but there are certain places where you don't need to temper, and particularly that is with love. You can never have too much love, at least not for the right things. And so in a place where it's charity, in a place where it is a desire to grow closer to God, those are things you can't have too much of. And so Saint Benedict is now going to introduce himself. And we see that he led a life of contemplation as well, but his life of contemplation also had an outward effect. he settled in this monastery that ultimately Christianized the area that he settled. And such abundant grace shone down on me, I led the neighboring towns away from impious worship that misled the world. All these other flames spent their time in contemplation, kindling by the warmth which brings both holy flowers and holy fruits to birth. He introduces Macarius and Romaldus, and Dante is so warmed and encouraged by St. Benedict, and he feels this sort of and he feels as if St. Benedict is another father figure for him here. And so he asks to see St. Benedict's face. There's this echo of Moses asking God to show him his face. And because Benedict is, again, clothed in light, each of the souls is so bright that all we see is the shining. But Dante desires to draw closer to this soul and actually see his aspect. And St. Benedict says, when we ascend to the very center of everything, when we're in the presence of God, all of your desires, which will be completely pure at that time, will be fulfilled. There only all we long for is perfected, ripe, and entire. It is there alone each element remains forever in its place, for it is not in space and does not turn on poles. Our ladder mounts right up to it, and thus its top is hidden from your sight. Here is the point of ascension. And in this contemplation, this growing closer to the face of God, our vision, our desire grows purer and more whole, and everything that we see is more perfect. So, starting in line 70, St. Benedict begins to shake his head and point out the failures of his order that he established so long ago. It begins with the image of Jacob and Jacob's ladder, which we've already introduced, and how Jacob looked up towards heaven. But here, all of these people who have followed St. Benedict throughout the years have failed to look upward. Line 73, but no one bothers now to raise his foot up from the earth to climb those rungs, and my rule is but a waste of paper. Instead, we see that those people who are involved in the Benedictine rule are failing at temperance. Instead of contemplation, they are interested in usury and in greed. And then St. Benedict compares his beginning to the beginnings of St. Peter and St. Francis. And he talks about how each one of them began in humility, in poverty. Line 88, Peter started his community with neither gold nor silver, and I mine with fasting and with prayer, and Francis with humility established his. If you consider where each started out, and then consider how far it now has strayed, you shall see how dark its white has turned. So this road of corruption that all of these orders established on temperance, on humility, on giving up of oneself have been corrupted into selfishness and corruption. But St. Benedict doesn't end with this negative perspective. He actually ends with hopefulness. He points out some great miracles of the past and says, if these can be so, then surely even our corrupted legacies can be corrected and improved and reformed. At this point, St. Benedict turns and rises up the stair like a whirlwind. Beatrice as well beckons Dante to follow, and both of them follow after up the stairs in incredible speed. And never once down here below, where we mount and descend by natural law, was their motion swift enough to match my flight. And as Dante begins to rise, he's now rising through the stars, and he actually rises through his own sign, which is Gemini. And in this moment, he reflects on his birth and on his talent and his skill, which he was marked for by birth. And here under his own star, he calls to his star to guide him and help him as he's rising to an even harder thing to describe, which is the final section of the Paradiso. And so this becomes an invocation, not of the muse, but of his own star. And we've seen that Dante's sort of relationship between his star and his genius, as he's talked about in the past. If we remember when he was speaking with Ulysses down in the Inferno, he was talking about how he, for a moment, had this swelling of pride, which had led him to think so highly of his own art and his own poetry. And in the moment of seeing Ulysses and listening to Ulysses, we saw that he realized that he needed to hold his genius in check. And at that moment, he realized that it was just a gift from above. There's that same idea we saw with some of the souls here in Temperance, the idea that Peter Damian was talking about a moment ago, that the true gift is divine love. And our own genius, when we focus on our own genius, we focus on ourselves, we focus on our own interests and desires, we become less what we should be. But when we focus outward and we focus on divine will, divine wisdom, divine love, ultimately that molds and guides our actions to the concept of us becoming more what we should be. And Dante here remembers the beginning of his sculpting in the fact that he was born under this sign, which set him to be a poet and set him influenced him in the way that he deals with life. And yet, ultimately, as he's growing closer and closer to the center of all things in the universe, he is able to understand himself more fully. When he was talking to Ulysses, he talked about his star guiding him, but he also talked about a higher grace, which was shining through that. And here we see that idea again. Now, as they've ascended above Saturn even, Beatrice tells him to look back down one more time. "You are so near the final blessedness," Beatrice then began. "Your eyes from now on shall be clear and keen. Thus, before you become more one with it, look down once more and see how many heavens I have already set beneath your feet, so that your heart filled with joy may greet the triumphant throng that comes in gladness to this ethereal sphere." And so it's time to look back down where he's come and review before they achieve the final goal.
It's time to review for me and for you as we soar through the blue, past a planet or two. Gotta learn what to do to be noble and true. Now it's time to review for me and for you.
And Dante looks back down through these 7 spheres that he's just passed, and all the way down to Earth. And Earth looks so little and tiny and insignificant and paltry down there. "I saw this globe of ours to be such that I smiled, so mean did it appear. That opinion which judges it as least, I now approve as best. And he whose thoughts are fixed on other things may truly be called just." Again, Dante's learned that his thoughts have to be higher than himself, higher than an internal focus. They have to be to the stars. As we've seen at the end of each canticle of the Divine Comedy, we're constantly looking up. And he glances back through each of the planets that he visited on his way up, and he names them not by their actual name, but by a parent of the figure they are named after. And so we had the moon, where we saw imperfect faith. And then we had Mercury, where we saw imperfect hope. And then we had Venus, where we saw imperfect love. And then we arrived at the sun, which was all about wisdom. And then we arrived at Mars, which was all about courage. And we arrived at Jupiter, which is about justice. And finally, we just ascended from Saturn, which is about temperance. Yay, review!
It's time to review for me and for you.
And he concludes this vision back through all of these planets by turning back towards Beatrice and preparing for what he's going to see next. What will it be? You'll find out when we get into the starry sphere next time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.